You know, as a high school kid, I didn't have much of an appreciation for poetry. Frankly, I kind of hated it. But today we're going to look at one famous poet who really did manage to capture my attention. And this poet might just have something to teach you about getting to the very end of your life and having the ability to look back and have absolutely no regret. Today I think I want to talk to you about one of the more tragic stories that comes out of the early 19th century, and that's the case of the famous poet George Gordon Byron, or as most people know him, just Lord Byron. I've been fascinated by this guy ever since I was a kid because even though I wasn't really a big fan of poetry, there was something about his work that kind of arrested my attention, and there was one poem in particular that kind of stuck in my craw just because of the first few lines. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and light meet in her aspect and her eyes. Now, at first glance, when you read that, it looks like a tribute to a beautiful woman, the love of the poet's life. But once you understand a little bit about who Byron was, you quickly realize he had some pretty big problems. Yeah, he probably had a specific woman in mind when he wrote that poem, but over the course of his lifetime, he fell in love, or probably more accurately, fell in lust with an awful lot of people, including some close relatives. And by that, I'm not just talking cousins, but possibly even his own half-sister, because he didn't have much in the way of personal moral boundaries. Maybe the best single-word description that we could give Lord Byron is hedonist, because a hedonist is somebody that lives for pleasure, and maybe the most telling fact about his life is just how short it was. This guy was dead by the age of 36. Of course, lots of people die young for all kinds of reasons, and in Byron's case, he died from an infection he picked up while visiting Greece in order to support their war of independence against the Ottoman Empire. But everything up to that point in his life suggests that he was probably going to die young no matter what happened, wherever he happened to be, because he was, well, a hard-living young man. And I suppose I could regale you with all kinds of salacious stories about Lord Byron's romantic encounters, but I don't think I have to, because most people in our generation have no trouble imagining what kinds of things he might have been doing because, well, to put it bluntly, a lot of people in our generation have been living like hedonists themselves. The motto for our generation was probably best stated by Life magazine back in 1969, where an article described the growing counterculture movement by saying that its sacraments were sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And as many people now realize, Western civilization has paid an enormous price for that lifestyle, ranging from the explosion in sexually transmitted diseases to the decline of the nuclear family to a general increase in selfishness that appears to value personal pleasure above just about anything else. Back in the 1970s and 80s, we called ourselves the me generation, as if putting self first was some kind of brand new phenomenon that suddenly emerged in the 20th century. The truth is, we've all been selfish most of the time, and it's a condition that dates all the way back to the beginning of recorded history. And what happens from time to time is that various societies suddenly seem to forget why we have moral boundaries, and we begin to ignore things like self-control or restraint. With our own generation, I think we've actually come to the point where we've not only pushed the boundaries of civility, we now make fun of people who still respect those boundaries. A virgin waiting for marriage, most people shake their heads. They can't believe somebody would do that. They think there's something wrong with that person. Somebody who never cheats or never lies, not even on their income tax, well, that's another butt of jokes. Somehow the things we all used to agree on, the boundaries that kept our civilization civilized, well, a lot of them now seem like a curiosity from some other planet. So no, I don't need to tell you the exact stories of Lord Byron because honestly, his story is now probably our story. We're a people with very little restraint. Which brings me to something important that Byron wrote in a saga known as Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. As you've probably guessed, it's the story of Harold, a young man who goes on a pilgrimage to a number of countries, starting in Portugal and Spain and ending in Greece, where he bemoans the condition of people living under the Ottomans. And of course, it doesn't take long as you read this to realize that Byron is really talking about himself. This is autobiographical. And at one point, he says something that should make us all pay attention. Now, the language is a little bit dated, and it is poetry. And I'm going to struggle as I read this to you, but I hope you'll catch the essence of what he's saying. It says, "Whilome in Albion's isle there dwelt a youth, who knee in virtue's ways did take delight." So in other words, this guy didn't appreciate virtue. "But spent his days in riot most uncouth, and vexed with mirth the drowsy ear of night." So he parties all night. "Ah me, in sooth he was a shameless wight, sore given to revel in ungodly glee. Few earthly things found favor in his sight, save concubines and carnal company, and flaunting wassailers of high and low degree." What he's describing here, in essence, is a party animal, somebody who's devoted to the pursuit of pleasure. And what this really is a description of himself. Then a few lines later, he says this, and this is the part I want you to really see. He writes, "And now child Harold was sore sick at heart, and from his fellow bacchanals would flee." In other words, he's dying to get away from his party friends. "'Tis said, at times the sullen tear would start, but pride congealed the drop within his eye." So he really wants to stop partying. He doesn't want to live like this, but his pride won't let him stop. It continues. "Apart he stalked in joyless reverie, and from his native land resolved to go and visit scorching climes beyond the sea. With pleasure drugged, he almost longed for woe, and e'en for change of scene would seek the shades below." This guy in this poem is so sick of pleasure seeking that he almost wishes for a little bit of hardship, just for the sake of a little bit of contrast. And he resolves to go on a journey looking for the real meaning of life. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what Byron did himself, and then he dies while visiting Greece. Now, I don't know about you, but it kind of rips my heart out to see a man who has absolutely everything, born to a high station of life, served in the British House of Lords, never denied himself anything, and still he's profoundly unhappy because he never discovers what it really means to live an authentic human life. Now, I've got to take a quick break, but when we come back, I'm going to show you why Byron's case is even worse than you might think. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
When Lord Byron was a little kid, he had this Presbyterian nurse who actually used to read the Bible to him. And even though you'd never guess it by looking at his lifestyle, he actually really loved the Bible. The problem was that he just didn't live it. And by the time he became a hard-living, self-satisfying adult, he really struggled to figure out who he was. At one point he actually said, "I am so changeable, being everything by turns and nothing long. I am such a strange melange of good and evil that it would be difficult to describe me." You know, that kind of reminds me of something that the Apostle Paul wrote, except, of course, we know that Paul lived a life of self-denial. He said in the book of Romans, "For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members." In other words, Paul recognized that he had two essential natures that were in conflict. One nature longed to be in harmony with God. It made him want to be a decent person. But the other nature was always pulling him back towards selfishness in sin. This is an exceptionally powerful passage because, well, all of us struggle with that. And what we find is that Paul actually bothered to fight against his corrupt nature, and he tapped into God's ability to keep him on the straight and narrow. Lord Byron, however, Well, he just caved in. I'm such a blend of good and evil, he said. It's really hard to describe exactly what I am. Unfortunately, some of his friends had no trouble describing what he was, like Lady Carolyn Lamb, who famously said that he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I'd want that phrase on my tombstone. I guess there might be some people who think that's awesome, but not most of you. Now, here's where I'm going with all of this. I suspect that our own generation is not entirely unlike the Western Roman Empire right before it fell apart. It was populated by people who enjoyed the fruits of prosperity for hundreds of years, and they were so self-absorbed, so dedicated to the pursuit of self, that they hardly noticed their empire was perched on the brink of collapse. The barbarians were quite literally at the gates, and Rome was about to fall. In his famous book about the collapse of Rome, a textbook that he actually wrote for high school students, the historian Philip Myers describes the debauchery of Roman entertainment, and he tells us how it contributed to the collapse of Roman morality. Here's what he wrote. Almost from the beginning, the Roman stage was gross and immoral. It was one of the main agencies to which must be attributed the undermining of the originally sound moral life of Roman society. So absorbed did the people become in the indecent representations of the stage that they lost all thought and care of the affairs of real life. And the evil was not confined to the capital. In all the great cities of the provinces, the theater held the same place of bad preeminence in the social life of the inhabitants. The people of Carthage were shouting and applauding in the theater at the very moment when the Vandals were bursting open the city gates. The Roman world, he wrote, died laughing. Now that really is a pretty good description of the way we're living right now. To borrow a phrase from Neil Postman, I suspect that our civilization is busy amusing itself to death. And that makes us just like George Gordon Byron, who eventually got to the very end of his pursuit of pleasure and he found himself painfully empty. Which brings me to the pages of the Old Testament, to this statement that you find in the heart of the book of Isaiah. It's a statement that is describing the inadequate policies of their leadership back in that day. The leaders' inability to turn the nation around after it became detached from God. And this is how Isaiah describes it over in Isaiah chapter 28. He says, "For the bed is too short to stretch out on, and the covering so narrow that one cannot wrap himself in it." In other words, people can pursue their own interests. They can live by their own agenda, but eventually they're going to discover that peace of mind always seems to elude them. It's like sleeping in a toddler bed as a full-grown adult. The bed is too short, the blanket's too small. This is an experience I've personally lived through more than once. I've had to crash on somebody's love seat, and I'm 6 foot tall. And the biggest love seat they make is only 71 inches, which means I'm too tall by 1 inch. And of course, nobody sleeps with their feet pointed straight up, so it's actually too short by several inches. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but I promise you, there is no way for you to get comfortable. That's exactly the experience of Lord Byron. I guess it's like that famous description from the beginning of Augustine's Confessions where he writes, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." Actually, that whole quote is probably worth reading because it turns out that Augustine had a lot in common with Lord Byron. You see, before his conversion to Christianity, he was also a rather accomplished hedonist, completely devoted to the pursuit of personal pleasure. He describes it by saying, "I ran wild in the shadowy jungle of erotic adventures." That's a pretty vivid description. Eventually, Augustine came to the end of pleasure and realized that he was nothing more than an empty shell of a man. And so the whole quote from his Confessions reads like this. He says, "Man, a little piece of your creation, desires to praise you, a human being bearing his mortality with him, carrying with him the witness of his sin and the witness that you resist the proud. Nevertheless, to praise you is the desire of man, a little piece of your creation. You stir man to take pleasure in praising you because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." So what he's saying, and I believe he's right, is that all of us are restless. We know there's supposed to be a purpose for our existence, some reason to be here. And some people choose to find that purpose through pleasure. In other words, they take that attitude, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But not once in the history of this world has anybody, and I mean anybody, come to the end of his or her life after using it for nothing but raw pleasure and been satisfied with what they had. All of us are restless because we've been separated from the one thing that gives us purpose. And the one thing that gives us purpose is the Creator. Over in the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul describes the problem using these words. He writes that we exchanged the truth of God for the lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. At the end of the day, the pursuit of hedonism is nothing but the worship of self. It's the worship of a mere creature. And I don't know about you, but I don't want me for a God. I know that's going to come up empty because, well, I know what I'm made out of. So don't go away, because the good people at the Voice of Prophecy have something they want to share with you, but then I'll be right back with one of the most fascinating passages on this subject I've ever read in the Bible. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
At the end of the Babylonian captivity, the tribe of Judah returned to the city of Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the city. But human nature being what it is, most people back then turned to their own needs first, and the temple was left, well, partially unfinished. And the people in charge were busy working on their own lavish estates. The temple was the seat of God's presence among His people, and it was the most important structure in the city because it was tangible proof that the Jews were in a covenant contract with their Maker. It was a display of God's mercy, a place where the promise of Messiah and the redemption of fallen humanity was put on full display every single day. It was designed to show the world the path to true satisfaction, true fulfillment, which could only be found in a God who promises to restore us to what we were before the fall. But it didn't take long for these people to fall back into the pursuit of self. It's something that we all do. And here's how the Bible describes that situation in Haggai chapter 1. Now, you might want to pay attention to this because this is where the ancient Hebrews, Lord Byron, and you and I all meet up. I'll start reading now in verse 2, where it says, "Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying," this people, the Jews who returned to Jerusalem, "this people says, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built." So, they're procrastinating, putting off the hard work to some point in the future. Verse 3. "Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses and this temple to lie in ruins?" So, in other words, they were living in personal luxury while the temple was still basically a pile of rubble. Verse 5. "Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways," and here comes the important part. "You have sown much and bring in little. You eat but do not have enough. You drink but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put in a bag with holes." That's exactly the same situation that Byron discovered. You can pursue self all day long. You can devote yourself to personal pleasure, but you're going to discover that pleasure seeking is an itch that can never really be scratched. These people thought that if they devoted themselves to eating and drinking, they would find personal fulfillment. If only they had nice clothes and earned a lot of money, they could finally be happy. But the purse of self-fulfillment is a bag full of holes, and you're never going to fill it. You see, the problem with self-fulfillment is that the more you prop up your own self-importance, the more it takes to feed your ego. It's a never-ending pursuit, and it never leads to happiness. The book of Ecclesiastes puts it like this: All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Nathaniel Branden, who was a disciple of Ayn Rand, once wrote that pleasure for man is not a luxury, but a profound psychological need. And he was building on the idea that Ayn Rand preached. The pursuit of self actually leads to the best ethical system. And I guess to some small extent, she wasn't exactly wrong. Because in a fallen world populated by self-driven individuals, the best structure we've ever been able to come up with is to let people pursue their own interests and set up laws that force everybody to just stay in their own lane. It's a system that really has been, for the most part, working. I mean, honestly, none of us wants to go back to the Dark Ages when the state church dictated how you worship, when you worship, and what you're going to believe. Because at the end of the day, there is nothing moral about a forced morality. So people need to be free to live by the dictates of their own conscience, no matter what they happen to believe. So yeah, in some ways I agree. People should be free to pursue their own pleasure however they want, as long as they're not hurting somebody else. It's really the only thing that works in a broken world. But to suggest that pleasure seeking is a profound psychological need, well, that's only partly true, and this is where I have to disagree. Everybody needs to be free to do what they want, because after all, God has allowed everybody the freedom of choice. But what hedonism does is offer a shallow substitute for what your heart is really looking for. You and I have been disconnected from the source of life, from the one who made us, and there is nothing else in the universe that is going to fill the deepest need you have. Don't go away. I'll be right back after this message.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
There's a really important concept found in the book of Acts, and maybe I'll finish the show with this today. Paul is speaking to a group of people in Asia Minor, a group that has tried to address their deepest spiritual needs in an inappropriate way. They know there's something missing, and because Paul appears to have worked a miracle in their midst, they think, well, maybe he's the answer to their problems. Here's what Paul tells them. Men, why are you doing these things? We preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Now that statement there, that's why I said you can't force morality on other people. It's because God Himself doesn't do that. He lets you go your own way. Now here comes the important part. Paul says, nevertheless, He did not leave Himself without witness, and that He did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Up to this point, you've been allowed to do whatever you want, because God doesn't force. What He wants is a real relationship. He wants you to want Him, the same way you crave having other people accept you for who you are. And unless you have the actual freedom to choose against God, you really don't have the freedom to choose for Him. So God has made you free to do whatever you want. But let me ask you this. How happy have you been with the results? If you've been living like Byron or Augustine, or like a million other hedonists, have you ever been able to scratch that itch in a way that really solves it? I'm in the 6th decade of life, and I can tell you, I've tried both ways. I've tried to find fulfillment on my own terms, and I've tried to find it God's way. And I can tell you, even though I'm a long way away from mastering the pursuit of God, there's a world of difference. Back in college, in one of those introductory humanities courses, the professor showed us Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you've seen it, you'll remember that at the top of his hierarchy, it says that your most profound need is self-actualization. And it's not entirely wrong, I guess, because most of us really are incomplete beings. We're not living an authentic life. But a sad majority of us seem to think that an authentic life can be found on the road that Byron traveled. After he was finished with drugs and sexual conquest, he felt the need to go on a long trip, hoping to find some kind of spiritual rebirth. And I strongly suspect he never found it, because you only find that in one place. At the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, there's this astonishing scene where God sends one final message to our failing planet. And here's what it says. It's in Revelation chapter 14. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment has come, and worship Him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of waters." Now, I know a lot of people automatically focus on the judgment part of that passage, and to be honest, you probably shouldn't ignore that part of it. The pursuit of pleasure is something that eventually you will have to answer for. But what I want you to notice for the purposes of our discussion today, it's this. This passage, it's describing a final warning to the world that our way of doing things isn't fixing our key problems. Our way of doing things is not going to lead to self-fulfillment. And it's actually speeding up the process of self-destruction. I think that's probably the takeaway from Lord Byron today. But then, as God always does, He presents us with a solution. And the solution is this: worship Him who made. In other words, come back to your Creator. That's where fulfillment is. Look, on your own, you're not going to reach a point in your life where you say, nothing's missing anymore. Your life is like a campfire. If it's just about self-pursuit and self-pleasure, the more wood you put on it, the hotter it burns. You'll never get to the point where the fire's no longer hungry. And you're not going to get to the point, if you're just feeding self, where you say nothing is missing. Not until you discover the real purpose for your existence. And the real purpose for your existence is a dynamic connection to the Creator Himself. It's what you were born for. So now you got to ask yourself, what would you have to lose by reading this book? I know some of your friends mock it. I know critics rail against it. But have you read more books written by critics than you've actually spent time reading this book for yourself? You've been chasing your own dreams and your own desires your whole life, and so far it's not working. And I want to suggest to you that if you were to give this an honest chance, maybe, just maybe, you might find what you've actually been looking for. I'm Shawn Boonstra. Thanks for joining me today. You've been watching another episode of Authentic.